Kia ora, everyone. My name is John Dalrymple Alford, which is a bit of a mouthful, and thankfully most people just abbreviate it to John DA. So I'm going to be talking more generally now about dementia, and commenting very briefly on some variations of different types of dementia, and especially risk and potentials for prevention, perhaps down the track. Now, the sad news is, or rather the good news is, if we age, we're still alive, but the longer we're alive, the more we are at risk of dementia. So by far the sort of strongest risk factor for dementia is certainly aging. And you'll notice in the second line there that maybe 3% of people at the age of 65 might be suffering from dementia, and this doubles every 5 years thereafter. And the problem really is more to do with a severely truncated health span. The lifespan itself is not such a big issue. The question is the quality of health that people have once they actually get dementia there. And of course also then there's a huge impact on families and whānau and friends, and of course health resources. And of course, as we all know, our population is aging, and it's aging fast in terms of the relative number of people who are older, which is largely brought on by the baby boomers, such as myself, I must say. And the issue is that where perhaps in New Zealand there are, in recent times, 60 or maybe now 70 or 80,000 people, it's anticipated that this will be at the order of 170,000 by the time we get to 2050. So it's a major issue. Also, people in society are living longer, but Maori in particular are living much longer now than they used to. So their rates of increase of the number of people who will be suffering from dementia is increasing markedly. And the diagnosis of people with Maori with dementia is generally, at this point in time, 8 years earlier than Pākehā and about 3 years younger than Pacifica. Now, of course, all of us have the occasional memory lapse. That's fairly normal. And the problem for many of us is, as we age and we have a memory lapse, we immediately begin to think, oh, is this the start? Are we on the slippery slope here? So it's normal for us to have some degree of forgetfulness. In fact, if forgetfulness is a major issue, then I can confirm that the majority of my students at university must be suffering from dementia. Of course, the problem is the severity of that problem. You know, if you forget to buy the eggs, or you buy eggs twice, then that's not so bad. If you go and buy eggs every day of the week because you forget that you bought some eggs, then that begins to be an issue and a problem. So what's the difference then? What's the difference between sort of normal aging, where our cognitive faculties might begin to wane a little bit, compared to those who actually suffer from dementia per se? Well, the real difference is the extent to which the broadness and the severity of the problems that you might have, and the real tipping point is the degree to which you maintain your own independence. So loss of independence in everyday activities, they're the critical difference between people who have now got to the point of maybe getting a diagnosis of dementia versus those who might be having cognitive decline, and some people may be having a decline in their cognition and their general thinking that's worse than the average person of their age, and they may well be on a path towards, on a dementing path, as it were, and towards the final diagnosis. So the important thing to remember, though, is there's no one single thing that's dementia. There are many, many different reasons behind why people might be suffering from dementia. And there are many different kind of what's described, we heard before about genes producing proteins. Well, some of those proteins, or many of those proteins, are obviously critical for a whole range of functions in the brain, and some of those proteins go awry in the brain. And a variety of different proteins tend to go awry in different kinds of dementia. So basically then, the important thing to remember is it's a group of diseases. The other thing to remember, though, is that more and more we're beginning to realize the commonalities across different kinds of dementias, in the sense that there may be also problems with the blood-brain system. There may also be problems with neuroinflammation, and all of these may interact in different ways. And even the different proteins that might be happening might be interacting in different ways to exacerbate the problem in front of us. So Alzheimer's dementia is the obvious thing that most people know about or have heard about. But in reality, Alzheimer's dementia per se is probably responsible, many people think now, for the order of 50% of those, that range of different dementing conditions. The other ones over here shown are sort of vascular dementia, where primarily the culprit is to do with blood supply to the brain, Parkinson's disease and related conditions may be responsible for a similar number. There may be a whole raft of other things, including alcohol and various kinds of disease issues that might occur. And there's a range of things that are called frontotemporal dementias as well, which tend to, again, have a different sort of classification or spread of different characteristics of different types of proteins. But the picture is getting more complicated than that. So very often what we do is we'd be looking at the actual presentation of the individual to have a hunch as to which kind of dementia problem the person may have. But in reality, sometimes what we've learnt now is that people may have a similar clinical syndrome, but the cause may be slightly different. So for example, something now called late, where it's now been discovered that those individuals who are over 80, then maybe about half of those might be suffering from something that's caused primarily by a different protein misfolding or misbehaving protein compared to Alzheimer's disease itself, even though the presentation itself is very similar. And the other thing that's really come to the fore in very recent times is as they've got more and more information and started to look at more and more different kinds of dementing conditions, we realized that really there is quite a degree of mixed pathology taking place. So even someone, for example, with Parkinson's disease may very well have elements of Alzheimer abnormal proteins as well. People who've got, certainly those who've got the new one, the late dementia condition, will also have a variety of other problems also. So mixed pathology appears to be a major issue. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because when we think about how to treat those dementias, very often the argument in the past has been, let's focus on the actual culprit, the abnormal protein itself. Now, you need to then understand that protein, you need to understand why it's misbehaving, you need to understand why the brain's not dealing with that protein properly. But the issue then is that you tend to be narrow in your thought processes. You tend to home in on one particular protein when there may be a variety of different other proteins happening too. So we need to have a broader view, as it were, in terms of those potential treatments down the track. So here's Alzheimer's disease. What are the two misfolded culprits here? Well, one is called amyloid, and this is where there are sticky clumps of abnormal protein basically between the cells shown over here. And then there are another protein called tau, which creates tangles generally inside the neurons themselves. So these two different characteristics together mean that we can classify an individual as suffering from Alzheimer's disease. So the neuropathology, as it were, defines the fact that now we think this person's got Alzheimer's disease per se. And there's a big push to try to better understand how we can classify people in that fashion by identifying these abnormalities. So Tracy, for example, talked before about how we can visualize amyloid in the brain, and there are also now opportunities to visualize tau abnormalities in the brain too. There are problems with some of the other proteins. We're still struggling to actually get a good picture on what they might be in order to have a better idea of what might be taking place. So here's a healthy brain on the right, or rather from an individual who had been healthy at the top, and an individual who'd been suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And very quickly you can visualize a huge loss of brain tissue has happened. So with any kind of dementia, what will happen will be a progressive loss of brain tissue, and that in turn will give rise to a range of behavioral and psychological problems. Now in Alzheimer's disease though, and also perhaps in quite a few other types of dementing conditions, the problem really also involves this culprit over here. So a place in the brain called the hippocampus that was mentioned earlier. Now I should say that neuroscientists are probably slightly over-obsessed with the hippocampus. And the hippocampus itself, the name translated means seahorse. So lots of places in the brain that we look at have unusual Latin and sometimes Greek names, and all they are is a description of what the person at the time, the neuroanatomist, thought that they could see. So back in the day, someone decided that they thought they could see a seahorse, and the international language at the time would be Latin or Greek, so they translate that to hippocampus. And of course, these days, if you go around telling individuals that your focus is the seahorse in the brain, well, you sound a wee bit weird. So telling them it's the hippocampus, nobody understands, it's a nice long word, and that's okay. But there is actually, I did identify someone who had actually dissected out the actual hippocampus and adjacent structures, and you can see it is a bit reminiscent of a seahorse when you look at it in that direction. So once again, what happens is that people focus on areas like the hippocampus, where here's a relatively healthy hippocampus, Here's a loss of tissue associated with the hippocampus. The real culprit in this region of the brain probably is actually the cortical tissue just adjacent to it. And changes there might spread. And that's one of the problems with these proteins. When they start going awry in one place, they spread to adjacent places. And then from those places, they may spread yet further. And so a lot of the problem that we have to deal with is try to understand how we can keep that spread in check. Here is a quick diagram of that misfolding that takes place. You might have individual molecules over there, and they may come together as small clumps, and then they may grow to be larger clumps, and the problem is these may seed other clumps to occur in other brain regions. And so a lot of the focus is try to understand how can we deal with this, what can we do to address that problem. And thus far, we've not come up with any way that would genuinely address this issue. Huge number of people are trying, and we will get there, I'm absolutely sure, one day. I'm not so sure if we're going to get there in my lifetime, but we're certainly going to make some progress towards how we can deal with that. So now we can switch to, well, if we're struggling with actually how to deal with the protein abnormalities and the other problems that occur, why is it, for example, that there are some people who have neuropathology in the brain, yet they haven't reached dementia? Why is it that some people, for example, have low neuropathology, but their brain function or their cognitive function, the way they think, is relatively frail? And so lots of people are trying to understand how we can actually understand what's going on in this respect with respect to resilience when neuropathology occurs. Because strangely enough, lots of people will have Alzheimer's pathology in their brain, but they won't necessarily have Alzheimer's dementia per se. Now, many people think that if they have enough Alzheimer's pathology in their brain, they will get Alzheimer's. So if we live to 120, you're going to get Alzheimer's. Now, this might be an issue for the younger generation coming forth, certainly my grandchildren, where many people think now that those individuals probably might on average live to the age of 100. And the older you are, remember, the more you are at risk in terms of Alzheimer's disease and other kinds of dementia. So how can we understand this in order to help resolve at least some aspects of the problem to hand? And that's where this picture comes into play. When people look at the kinds of things that are associated with your risk of dementia, there seems to be a great number of different aspects that collectively together have a huge contribution to the total number of people who will progress to dementia over time. And some people think that perhaps there's about 35% of the risk is down to factors that we can modify. Now, if we can modify throughout our lives the risk of many of these factors, we would reduce the number of people who get to Alzheimer's or other dementias before they die. And at minimum, the hope is it will defer the actual onset of that condition. Now, if you had a choice, you're going to get Alzheimer's, you have no credit. I'm sorry, you will get Alzheimer's. If you live to 100, you're going to get Alzheimer's. Would you rather get Alzheimer's when you're 80 or 70, or when you're at 100, when it might be the point of death? Now, most people would choose to be relatively healthy for a longer period of time. And it may be that many of these things that we're looking at here might have a direct influence on some of the neuropathology, but maybe what they also do is to enable your brain to be more protected against the neuropathology that will occur. So, for example, here's a lifespan view of the kind of things that might have an influence, with some examples. And at the top of the list over here in blue, so that's early in life, is education. There is no question whatsoever that a high degree of education has a huge influence on reducing the prevalence of Alzheimer's and other dementias later in life, and certainly putting off the point in time in which that might occur in individuals. There may be many other things that are important too. For example, we've learned that good hearing is also a relevant factor. Now, quite the relationship between hearing and the probability of progressing to dementia or not is still slightly uncertain. Some people think that it might actually be something to do with what's described as reverse causation. That is, when your hearing or some aspects of hearing get worse, then maybe that might be a signal that there might be problems taking place. And if that is a signal, then that's an early warning sign that we can then use to try to intervene to reduce the probability of someone progressing. There are other aspects too, though, a whole raft of things over here associated with your vascular health, associated with how good your metabolism is, associated with things like, for example, susceptibility to diabetes that make a huge difference. And we know from work that's focused just on that, outside of the context of dementia, that can have a huge influence in reducing the rates of those kinds of problems. And so reducing the rates of those kinds of problems will feed forward to reducing the rates at which people might then also be suffering from dementia later in life. We know also that inflammation in the brain might be important, and infections and how we better treat those may play also a huge part. And we know also that good and varied diet is important. In my book, if someone says to you, here's the specific diet that will stop you getting Alzheimer's, then I'd say don't believe them. If someone says to you a good, healthy, varied diet is likely to be helpful, I would say yes. But we don't yet know precisely what. And some of the problems is that some of the research focuses on one little thing, and what we're really learning more and more is it's a global picture. There's a huge raft of many different things that must add up. And the big problem, of course, is that it's easy for us to latch on some single thing. So you think about education. Right, if you go to university forever, I tell my students, you'll never get Alzheimer's. Now, tongue-in-cheek, admittedly. But in doing that, we're focusing on an individual thing, when really it's a whole raft of things across our lifespan that makes a difference, and that could hugely drop, or rather put off, before we die, whether or not we will get dementia later in life from one cause or another. Here's an example then of a relationship, an association between education, or years of education rather, and your genetic risk. Among the many genes that might be influencing whether someone gets Alzheimer's or not, one at the top of the list is something called ApoE. And there are different variations of genes, just like we heard with Huntington's. There may be sort of changes in the gene that might have an influence on your health. And if you have something called ApoE4, if you have that variant, and if you have one or two of those, the probability of progressing to Alzheimer's later in life is elevated. And this picture shows a study that's looked at the relationship between those two factors, whether you have ApoE4 or not, versus the level of education. And the differences here is quite dramatic. So this is a study from Finland, if I remember rightly, where if you had less than 6 years of education and you had that risk factor, then you had an increased risk, as you'd expect, of progressing to dementia later in life. But over here, if you had 9+ years of education, then irrespective of the gene that you have a less likely progression to later dementia, even though the difference between the genes is still the same. So the genes are having an impact, but education is changing the level of that impact. So these differences are fairly dramatic, and similar kinds of research also is evident in many other areas as well. One of the questions also is to do with whether or not the education or the cognitive training or the cognitive experiences have to happen early in life. And there's some evidence like this, for example, that no, even later in life, the level of complexity in your life may actually put off or delay the onset of dementia. And again, this is one of those where people are arguing, well, which way round is it? You know, is it that people who are cognitively more healthy are going to do things, and really that means they're going to stay healthy and they won't get Alzheimer's disease, as opposed to directly that will influence whether they will get Alzheimer's or not. But nowadays what's happening is that people are starting to look more and more at various kinds of interventions, and the evidence so far seems to point to, once again, just as I showed earlier, a combination of things is important. Focusing on just one thing doesn't seem to be working. Focusing on multiple things in people's lives seems to be having some degree of benefit. And this is kind of encapsulated here. So at the very center, genes are important. There's no question. That's who you are. But things interact with genes, and life interacts with what happens when you interact through the environment. So there'll be a whole raft of things here: social activities, cardiometabolic factors, cognitive activities, general lifestyle, and nutrition will have an influence. And we know also that the environment itself will have an influence. So living in an air-polluted environment, there is evidence that increases, on average, the rate at which that population will be showing dementia. And so we end up with an idea, a situation like this, and this is what we need to do. So we need to have population health, as it were, at the centre, but we need to be able to look at a variety of different things related to that. So it goes from clinical cohorts, like the cohort that we have here for Parkinson's disease, through to genetics, through to metabolism related to genetics, looking at animal models to see if we can find ways to improve that abnormal protein metabolism when it occurs, all the way through back to population studies to actually learn what things might be helpful going back to the clinical cohorts themselves to see if that works. The message that many people say is the combination between the heart and the brain. And the usual thing that's trotted out is, which is true, what's good for the heart is good for the brain. But it's also true that what's good for the brain is good for the heart. Doing both those things, and the multitude of ways that we can do it, many people think is the way to reduce the wave of Alzheimer's and other dementias that are going to happen in the future here. So in terms of the new NZBRI, we're associated with something called the Dementia Prevention Research Clinic, where we're inviting people who might be suffering from thinking and memory problems more than they might anticipate, in order then to explore whether or not this is something that's indicative of someone who's in trouble progressing to one of those dementias that we've talked about. Thank you.